Greetings, fellow humans, and welcome to the Renaissance Yorkshireman podcast. Next week, from the 25th till the 29th of January 2021, there will be the Davos Agenda, where the World Economic Forum will be meeting in Davos and discussing various issues. Next week, I would like to make videos every day of this conference about the World Economic Forum. This is important. Why, you may ask? Well, I think it's very important to talk about the agendas of the World Economic Forum, such as their ideas for Capitalism 2.0, which I am fundamentally opposed to as a post-capitalist, and I say that my manifesto for post-capitalism is better than their manifesto for Capitalism 2.0. But before we get there, I feel it's necessary to discuss some kind of background issues, because if we don't have the right starting point, it's very difficult to understand many of the ideas of the World Economic Forum and why they are problematic. So in this video, I'd like to talk a little bit about Marxism, where I agree with Marxism and where I disagree with Marxism, and a little bit about the nature of consciousness, and in particular the way that I understand consciousness as a Buddhist, as opposed to how a Marxist would generally define the nature of consciousness. Before I get into Marx and Marxism and where I agree with it and where I disagree with it, I'd like to read you a quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald, the writer of The Great Gatsby. He says, "Let me tell you about the very rich. They are different from you and me. They possess and enjoy early, and it does something to them, makes them soft where we are hard, and cynical where we are trustful, in a way that, unless you were born rich, it is very difficult to understand." Rich people, and the super rich in particular, are different from you and me. And I'm going to, in tomorrow's video, talk a little bit about the dark triad of psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism, which I have talked about in a previous video, but I feel it's fundamentally important to understanding these kind of people, why they do what they do, and what they're doing. I'm going to give a very simplified version of what I think is a fair representation of Marxism. And essentially, I'm splitting it into two parts. The Marxist analysis of what is going wrong with the capitalist system, which I largely agree with, and the Marxist analysis of the solutions for the problems of capitalism, which I largely disagree with. And this essentially is why I am not a Marxist, because I disagree with their solutions to the problem as they analyse it. So basically, in a nutshell, Marxists say, if you are part of the working class, and we can define the working class in many different ways, but essentially, if you are not renting out property to make a living, so you have to go out and do a job, you are working class. If you have multiple properties that you rent out and you can live on that, or you own factories and other people work for you and you live off their labour, then you are part of what Marx and Marxists would call the bourgeoisie. There are now other expressions which are often used for these people: the moneyed class, the super rich, the 1%, blah, blah, blah. But let's stick with the bourgeoisie for this video because I'm talking about Marxism. In a nutshell, if you're part of the working class, the bourgeoisie will exploit you. That's it. And I think when we look at the world, we can see that basically this is true. If we look at income distribution in the world, 10, 15, 20% of people are living in absolute grinding poverty. Another 10, 20% are just about getting by, and another, 30, 40% are part of what is now called the precariat, whereby if they had some kind of crisis for 2 or 3 months, they'd pretty much be on the street. And at the top, there's 5 or 10% of people who are doing pretty well, but then there's the 1%, and even the 1% of the 1% of the 1% who are so mind-bogglingly rich, like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, that it just boggles the mind about how much money they have. An absurd amount of money that 100 people couldn't spend in their lifetimes. If you're not part of that extremely small moneyed class, you're being exploited. That's the Marxist argument in its essence. Now, of course, you can get much more nuanced about this, but in its essence, if you are not part of this money class, you are being exploited by the bourgeoisie. You're working class, you are being exploited. So that's the Marxist analysis of what's going wrong with capitalism. And I'd have to say I give it an 8 or a 9 out of 10. It's pretty spot on. Stinking rich people do exploit everyone else. The second part of the argument of Marxist, in my simplified analysis, is that the solution to the problems of capitalism is a communist revolution. And I fundamentally disagree with this for all sorts of reasons. During the Russian Revolution of 1917, they threw out one group of psychopathic, parasitical thugs, and in came a different group of psychopathic, parasitical thugs. And if we look at the history of the Russian Communist Party, they killed millions of people, tens of millions of people. Particularly if we look at the Soviet Union under Stalin, I mean, just horrendous. Through all sorts of different methods, just taking people away and shooting them and burying them in shallow graves, sending them to the gulag, all sorts of very unpleasant things. At the same time that this was happening in the capitalist West, particularly in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, capitalism was sponsoring various insurgencies and counterinsurgencies in the name of anti-communism, and hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, possibly tens of millions of people were killed in the name of anti-communism. So we have, on the one hand, communism killing tens of millions of people, anti-communism killing millions of people. It's an absolute shit show. And one of the things that capitalism and communism have in common is that they essentially agree on the rules of the game, materialism. And there's a complete lack of spirituality. So everything's in terms of resources, physical resource use. Now, physical resource use is extremely important for humans, but it's not everything. And if we completely reject this kind of spiritual element, then we're going to get this kind of shit show where arms dealing is quite acceptable and funding terrorists and insurgencies is also acceptable. It's not acceptable, and the arms trade is not acceptable. And this brings me to the second quote I'd like to read for you from Brett Weinstein's 2016 article, Anthropic Capitalism and the New Gimmick Economy. And he says, capitalism and communism, which briefly resembled Victor and Vanquished, increasingly look like Thelma and Louise, a tragic couple sent over the edge by forces beyond their control. What comes next is anyone's guess, and the world hangs in the balance. Communism failed, capitalism is currently failing, we need post-capitalist and game B systems. And this brings me to my second main point about the nature of consciousness. In a classically Marxist analysis, consciousness is defined as class consciousness. So it's a socio-economic political thing. It's about understanding who your allies are, who your enemies are, where your interests lie, and how you can fight for your interests. Now, I believe that this is fundamentally important to understanding what it means to be a human. It's necessary, but it is not sufficient. We need these thinking skills and ways of analysing the world, but as of their own, they're not sufficient. I grew up in Britain, which is a primarily Christian/atheist society based on liberal capitalist democracy. And I discovered Buddhism when I was 16 years old, and I took refuge in the north of Thailand in the Thai Buddhist tradition in November 2012. So I formally converted to Buddhism. And my understanding of consciousness is different from this Marxist understanding of class consciousness, although my understanding includes that. In Buddhism, one of the fundamental parts is to have a meditation routine and meditate every day. There's been a huge amount of research on meditation, and the research is very clear. People who meditate every day enjoy better mental health and better physical health than those people that don't meditate. And if that's not a good enough reason to start a meditation routine, then I don't know what is. In any case, I do have a daily meditation routine, and I can tell you from my own experience, it has improved my life in all sorts of ways. And the thing about meditation is, when Westerners come to Buddhism, they see a lot of what could perhaps be described as the advertising techniques of Buddhism. You can become enlightened. Here's all these supernatural stories about the Buddha. And while these things are interesting and, you know, may have a metaphorical truth, some of them have a literal truth, some of them probably don't. But the thing about meditation is it's about gradual change of yourself. And it's about understanding yourself, relating to other people, and relating to the natural world. And this is a much broader idea of consciousness than the more narrow version of Marxist consciousness, class consciousness. So we need to understand ourselves. We need to get along with other people, listen to other people, take on board their concerns, see where they're coming from psychologically as well as politically. And fundamentally, we need to change our relationship with planet Earth. So it's not this kind of capitalist and communist exploitation model of planet Earth. It's living in a dynamic balance with planet Earth where we have a fundamental respect for the planet that we live on. Thank you for giving me your time today. Peace. And remember, Julian Assange is still a political prisoner held by the British state in Belmarsh prison in London. This is completely unacceptable. Julian Assange must be freed today. Thank you.